Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking time to join our live webinar today called Redefining Logistics and Retail Real Estate. We're also streaming this webinar on facebook.com Asia Real Estate Summit. This webinar is hosted by PropertyGuru Asia Real Estate Summit, the tech and thought leadership platform of PropertyGuru, Southeast Asia's leading property technology company and the organizer of the industry-leading Asia Property Awards series. PropertyGuru Asia Real Estate Summit also released this month its first ever digital white paper. Volume 1 is PropTech and the Responsible Innovator, which is now available for free download on asiarealestatesummit.com. And I really do encourage you to download. It's a free download to read that white paper. It brings together a lot of the things that occurred with everybody in 2020, including the Asia Real Estate Summit 2020. I am your moderator, Stephen Owen. I'm a value management specialist and sustainability advocate, and I'm the managing director of Quantum Thailand Limited. One of my previous roles was a board member of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. I'm also the chairperson of PropertyGuru Asia Real Estate Summit Virtual Edition, which opens on the 8th of December 2021. And you can find out more information about that on our website, asiarealestatesummit.com. For today's webinar, I'm joined by experts who will share insights and overview of the region's logistics and retail sector and discuss the impact of the pandemic and e-commerce on these segments, along with related issues on the supply chain and economic recovery. Before we meet our guest speakers, let me remind everyone that the first part of our webinar will consist of the presentations from our expert speakers. Once all speakers have finished their presentations, the second part of our webinar will be the Q&A, the question and answer session. Please feel free to leave your questions or comments in the Q&A chat on your screen, and we're really happy to receive and respond to those. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Dr. William Thomas, PhD, Director, Southeast Asia at the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network, who will deliver today's opening keynote presentation. Michael Ignatiades, sorry for that, Michael, Head of Supply Chain and Logistics Solutions at JLL Asia Pacific, and Paul Ashburn, ASPAC Leader, HLB Real Estate Group and co-managing partner of HLB Thailand, who are the official sponsor of the PropertyGuru Asia Property Awards. It's a fantastic lineup and a very interesting topic that faces us all in the property sector. I'd like to, without any further ado, hand over to Dr. William Thomas of the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network. William, thank you. I think we're having a technical difficulty. Please bear with us for one moment.
We've had some technical issues here on my end. I want to make sure you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can, William. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And I will get that camera back up here in just 1 second. And let's try this again. So again, apologies there. Really never expect that to happen just as you're about to go on, but it occasionally does. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for inviting me in today to join in with you on this session. What I want to do is just very quickly give you a bit of an overview of the economic recovery here in Asia and some of the factors affecting that recovery, and then touch on a couple of the implications of that, which our other speakers are going to be digging into in a little more detail. So if we could, let's go ahead and take a look at this next slide here, looking at some of the recoveries that we're seeing around the different markets in the region. So one of the things you see is that the economic recovery from the pandemic here in Asia is very uneven. You can see a number of markets up there near the top of that chart that are seeing stronger growth this year. And what we're seeing on this chart is simply a reflection of the GDP growth from the end of 2019, so right before the pandemic, up to the end of 2021. So you have a few markets, specifically China, Taiwan, Vietnam, that all saw some growth last year and are building upon that momentum this year. You have some other markets such as South Korea or Indonesia that saw some drop off last year, some reduction in GDP, but are recovering that this year and are moving forward. And so that's good to see. But then down at the bottom half, you see some other markets that lost ground in 2020 and are still working to recover that. So in places like Singapore, for example, where we expect to recover in early 2022, Malaysia expects to make that back probably in the second half of 2022. And then for Japan and some other markets like Thailand and the Philippines, it's going to be 2023 or even later before they're able to bounce back. Now, there are a number of factors that affect that, of course, including how well they were able to manage the coronavirus pandemic early on, what kind of fiscal stimulus governments pumped into the economy, and also what sectors in that economy are really important and how they were impacted by the pandemic. So, for example, a place like South Korea, which is very big on consumer electronics exports, saw not too much of a problem last year because when everybody got locked down, they wanted a new tablet so they could stream their shows. They wanted a new monitor, a new laptop because they were working from home. And so that's one reason that we see South Korea bouncing back this year. Compare that with a place like Thailand or the Philippines, where tourism is a dominant part of the economy. And of course, that industry has just been decimated in the last 18 months or so. So it's going to take longer for them to bounce back. Now, one of the things that is also going to affect a nation's recovery, the economic recovery in a market, is their ability to vaccinate their population. So if we look over here at the next slide, we see a timeline that we produce on a quarterly basis. Sorry, we produce this here on a quarterly basis to take a look at when populations are going to hit the mass vaccination levels. And sorry, everybody, I just saw there was a problem with my camera there. Apologies for that. What we're looking at on this slide is the point at which a country is expected to vaccinate at least 60% of its population. Now, when we started doing this back in January or early last year, when we started looking at vaccination possibilities and vaccination rates, 60% was a pretty good number to get to. We now realize it needs to be bigger than that. It needs to be probably closer to 80%. But for comparison purposes, we've kept that measure at 60%. So anyway, what you're seeing there is a number of markets that are going to hit the majority of their population this year, such as Singapore, where we're already at 82%. Hong Kong probably in the next quarter is going to hit the majority of its population. Early to mid 2022 is when you'll see a lot of populations getting vaccinated. And then as you get into 2023 and beyond, you do see some other markets there that are going to take a bit longer. So what this is showing, what this is suggesting here is that the opening up of economies is going to be very uneven, and the return to retail, the return to F&B, the return to social activities is also going to be very uneven across the region. That's something that I guess as you're looking around Asia, you're not going to be able to just say, how's Asia doing? But instead, you're really going to need to look market by market. Now, I mentioned that vaccinations are important for getting customers back into stores, for getting patrons back into restaurants and so forth. As we emerge from the pandemic, I do want to take a look at how we expect consumption to pick up over the rest of the decade. And so if we look at this next slide, what we'll see is that it's the emerging markets in the region that are really going to show the highest growth, the fastest rates of growth in consumption through the rest of the 2020s. So in particular, Vietnam are really looking to be very strong there at the top, followed closely by China, and then to a lesser extent, Thailand and the Philippines. These are markets that expect to see the fastest increases in consumption and the largest annual consumption growth over the rest of the decade. Now, the question we get a lot of times is, why is it these countries? Why isn't it the more developed countries that are perhaps moving faster? And the reason is that what we're seeing is the emergence of the middle class here in these markets, in China and Vietnam, and then in some of the other countries as well. So these are places that have always had a large inequality, large income gap, a wealth gap, and we're seeing now the filling of some of that gap. Certainly it isn't going away, but we are seeing a middle class that is continuing to grow and develop. Now, as that happens, as income levels rise and as consumers are spending more, they're also going to spend differently. So it's not just on different products, but it's also the way that they buy that we expect to change. So what you'll see here on this next slide is that if you look at the amount just in US dollar terms of online sales, you can see that growth, that expansion there in 2020 and 2021. And that's the dark blue for 2020 and the yellow line there for 2021. That is a trend that we expect to continue, and particularly in some of those emerging markets that are going to see the higher consumption. In many cases, that consumption is going to come through online, not necessarily through brick and mortar retail. In fact, Vietnam has a national policy, has a government policy suggesting that they want 50% of their population buying online by 2025. So that's a pretty dramatic increase for them. That's not to say 50% of all sales would be online, but they at least want 50% of the population feeling comfortable engaging in online retail. So there are certainly business trends and economic trends and technology trends that are driving towards online retail, but also some government policies that are driving in that direction as well, as they seek to take the consumerist culture out of the larger cities, or so that it's not only in the larger cities, and move it out to the rural areas. They are suggesting to leapfrog over some of the traditional growth models, and instead of going the brick and mortar route, instead jumping over that and going to a largely digital route. Now, the growth of online retail has had significant impacts on, among other things, supply chains. As we see on this next slide, there's quite a shift actually in this region in terms of supply chains. Some countries are pulling back a bit from the globalized model and focusing a bit more on a regional model, a regional supply chain model, in part because over the last 18 months or so, they've seen some of the challenges and some of the dependencies that put them at risk. And so to have a more resilient supply chain, they may want to have one that's a bit closer to home. We're also seeing some changes in trade agreements, such as the RCEP, which is coming into effect, the CPTPP as well, both of which are undergoing some changes right now, it seems. So that's kind of shifting the supply chain focus a bit more back into this region, and perhaps not as much on the global side, not decoupling from the global supply chains, but emphasizing the regional more. Another change that we're seeing is in the technology available for supply chains to provide data visibility, greater transparency, and improved predictive power, and that's going to be really valuable. Now, one of the reasons that governments and businesses have gotten concerned about the global supply chain is some of the political challenges that they faced in the last few years that involve other countries, but then impact them. And China and the US is the big one there. So for my last slide, I want to take just a quick look at China's international presence and the impact there. Obviously, you can't talk about Asia without talking about China. China's influence is certainly growing in the region. Over the last 20 years, it's become the largest trading partner for most countries in Asia, as well as across Africa and Latin America. And that influence is growing, not just in absolute terms, but also relative to the United States. So in the last 4 or 5 years, the US has pulled back a bit from Asia, and China has continued moving forward and building its influence. So that has given it a position of great strength and great power. We are seeing some unusual things happening in China in the last couple of months, a bit of a crackdown on the tech sector and the other industries such as digital currency, education, real estate development. That is leading some companies to look at perhaps moving out of China and into other places, but nobody's going to decouple from China because it's just too big. It's just too much of a powerhouse in the region. So that's what I wanted to introduce to you today. I'm going to be giving a longer talk and without all the technical glitches at the Asia Real Estate Summit. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll be delivering a keynote address there later this year, and very much looking forward to that. Also looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to share today. So thank you very much.
Dr. William, thank you, and very much looking forward to your keynote on the 8th of December this year at the Asia Real Estate Summit. And thanks for highlighting, I mean, the divergence of economic growth is very significant, as you showed, and the transition to recovery is going to be longer and sadly deeper than we had hoped. And I look forward to discussing that with you after all of our speakers today in the panel session about the direct effects in the real estate sector. It's very, very interesting, and thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. It's Michael Ignatiadis, and Michael is from Jones Lang LaSalle. Michael, thank you. Michael, your microphone.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. So great. Thanks for the intro. Great to be here. Definitely rethinking the go-to-market strategy. And this is creating a new landscape for supply chain real estate. And what I'm showing on this slide is that overall constant volatility and a supply chain that is very customer driven. This means that companies need to constantly adapt and change their footprint. I think some of the comments beforehand from Dr. Williams showed some of the macro trends that are also supporting this. So what I want to share in the next few slides is what's driving those changes. So how do they impact distribution and retail networks? And what kind of infrastructure is required to accommodate this change? Yeah, next. Great. So we can split these forces into the ones that have a greater impact beyond the city, so having more of a regional, global impact, and those with a greater impact within the city. So going to a more micro level and getting closer to the consumer. Next slide. Yes, great. So this matrix, shows the within the last 2 decades the disruptions we've seen. These are the 8 major ones, and each of those duration along the supply chain, but also for the different stakeholders. So it's not a surprise that the recent pandemic is the one that you see that was a global one. And actually this one really impacted distribution. So getting the inventory from the factory to the warehouse. And then companies are asking how to become more resilient in the future, right? What's coming next and how to address that. And one way is to address this challenge is more inventory, and more locations, and which hence more logistics real estate space. So going closer to the customer. Next. Yeah, great. So next slide. So if we look now within the city. Next slide. Yeah, within the city, we look at basically looking at. I'm seeing some comments about Stephen, can you hear me okay?
It has been a little bit choppy, Michael.
Okay. Let me remove my video just in case. Okay, so within the city, we're looking at the retail supply chains. So these are being forced to switch to the omni-channel model, which means anytime, anywhere retail, and soon for anything. And I think everybody's experiencing e-commerce firsthand, but what people often don't realize is what's happening in the back end, and so the complexity and the cost required to maintain this model. Next. Great. So adding to those forces, so we saw in last year additional pressures for supply chain networks within the city. So we saw retail closures. At the same time, e-commerce growing in record speeds, even now still growing. An example, the last November's Alibaba Singles Days, fantastic growth. But e-commerce is much more labor intensive. So it's much more volatile compared to fulfilling with traditional logistics operations, and so essentially fulfillment requires almost 3 times the space compared to traditional DC, which means so more e-commerce will mean more logistics space, more real estate for logistics requirements in the future. And in Southeast Asia, we know grade A modern facilities are in short supply. And finally, the last leg of the supply chain is mostly manual, is the least efficient and the of moving goods.
No, thank you, Michael. It's amazing how much the landscape is going to change, isn't it?
Yeah,
indeed. It really is, and I look forward to discussing that in the panel session after our last speaker, because it's going to have an extraordinary impact on the Asia property sector. It really is. Look forward to discussing that in the session. And a reminder to all our viewers, if you have any questions, please leave your comments in the Q&A section. I know that the audio there was a little bit choppy through a part of that. So if you have any questions whatsoever, please do not hesitate to ask questions. We're very happy to review and respond to those. So thank you very much. And for our last speaker, I'd like to welcome Paul Ashburn from HLB. Paul.
Thanks, Steve. The post-pandemic world awaits us all very soon, hopefully. No one knows for sure what it'll be like, but one thing's for certain, it's really going to be different, and especially the way we shop. I was talking at another PropertyGuru webinar recently, and I was asked, what changes do we see that are really going to be permanent following the pandemic? And I thought it's a really great question, which we don't have all the answers to yet. So first, I'd like to dive into some of the changes we've seen happen to date in retail and logistics. Next slide. At the moment, the digital economy is growing 2.5 times faster than the global GDP at the moment. And as a result, like in the UK, in just the first half of 2021, more than 8,700 British chain stores have had to close. And that's due to the pandemic, but also this shift to online. And then another statistic that coming out of the UK is that 14 brick and mortar businesses, offline businesses, are closed every day in the UK last year. So it just gives you an example about how quickly the digital business models are taking over. And then we've had acceleration of ghost kitchens in F&B, ghost retail, dark stores. A lot of goods now being home delivered, putting the pressure on the logistics industry. I think it's interesting to contrast this with Apple's strategy. Very early on, Apple decided that they're going to bricks and mortar. They're going to build their Apple stores, and they've been a great success. And now they have about 500 Apple stores globally. Now, they believe retail locations give them the opportunity for people to come in, experience the technology, ask questions, attend workshops, but they think they're going to be more happier to touch and feel their products in store again. So let's see how that works out for them. Live stream shopping, that's really growing as well. It's like infomercials on steroids, I'd say. A good example is in China. It's gone from 0 to 300 billion US as a business in a very short period of time. So I'd say infomercials, live stream shopping, looks like they're here to stay. The silver economy. And I thought, let's see what happened in the silver economy during the pandemic, because in Asia, there's a number of countries facing an aging population. For example, China, here in Thailand, and then we have Japan, which has the highest proportion of elderly citizens of any country in the world. And what they found was that in the pandemic, with the older people generally not being so mobile, confined to home, they did go online in a big way. And in China, as I state there in the slide, they saw internet usage increase 50%. And it's like one of the last frontiers that's coveted by the big e-commerce players. And one of the attractions is that they've measured in a study that they believe seniors could spend up to 2.3 times more than the average user. So it's a big market that with the pandemic, they've seen a lot more elderly aging citizens going online and shopping. Now, when we look at small businesses, an online platform allows them to reach a larger audience. And then with the pandemic, you've had lockdowns, there's less foot traffic, especially if you're located in a city, because now we have the workers are working from home and working from anywhere. You got the dealing with the landlords, the higher rents. So it's just making it harder to have a bricks and mortar store for small businesses to feed themselves. So there's been a big shift online for these smaller independent businesses. Now, one of the issues they face is that their activities are more visible. So they might have been part of this invisible economy before, but now they're visible. So for example, in Thailand, they said they've got a plan to get 500,000 individuals into the tax system. And mostly they're the people that are online selling things through Facebook and doing their social influencing, etc. And I think the same trend's happening in other Southeast Asian countries as well, including the Philippines. So if one thing's certain today, it's that the world will not return to how it operated pre-pandemic. Next slide. So when we look at the logistics industry, there's a big challenge in the timely and punctual delivery to customers, the so-called last mile. And what, with the pandemic, logistic operators and their employees are becoming more forefront for online retail. So it's not just a mere delivery platform anymore. Now we have couriers and delivery service providers having that more frequent contact with customers. So what I've shown here is a new sales digital ecosystem for Amway in Thailand. And this has just been recently announced. And they decided to team up with Kerry, a trusted delivery service provider in Thailand, to address this last mile issue. And you'll see in the diagram there that they have 4 steps, but that 4th step there where the customer service, they know they've got a trusted business partner there that's going to handle their client and maintain the satisfaction, even if Amway's not there themselves. Another example I'll give in Thailand is 7-Eleven. Now, there's 12,000 stores of 7-Eleven in Thailand. So you can imagine the logistics and distribution systems that they already had in place pre-pandemic. Now, they have an online store, shop24.com, and you can order products online, and then you can go to your nearest 7-Eleven, pick it up, or get home delivery. So recently, when I needed to buy a new laptop, my IT department told me to order it online at 7-Eleven. And that's what I did. And I went to the 7-Eleven store and picked it up. Worked fine. Next slide. I think it's worth mentioning that going green in real estate is still a big issue, you know, that with climate change and green practices kind of took a backward step due to the pandemic, but now it's coming back again at the top of the agenda as an issue the world needs to address with urgency. So in any disruption that's happening in the real estate market at the moment, they're going to have a lot of green considerations. And that could be forced on people by new regulations, but it also is coming down to corporates having their own, you know, regulations to make sure they address sustainability under their CSR guidelines. Digital capabilities are going to be very important, and choosing your alliances and partners. Like I mentioned before, Amway chose Kerry as their service provider. And these are going to be important in executing your environmentally friendly strategies. And of course, if it's not just about bettering the climate, it's going to be about building a better brand and the customer loyalty, whether they're offline or online. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier that the digital economy is growing 2.5 times faster than global GDP. And you know, you're in a pandemic, economies are suffering, governments want to maintain their you know, collections, their tax collections. So when they look at these big digital corporates, they're seeing that, you know, most of their revenues are not being taxed in country where the purchases are happening, where their customers are. So, like, for example, think of Google and Apple and many other digital companies. They choose Ireland to be located because of tax benefits. So what's going on at the moment is the OECD under the G20 are discussing a new work plan. And basically it's called a 2-pillar solution. And it's in particular addressing the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy. And it's going to be a major rewrite of tax laws and frameworks around the world for taxing businesses. Now, they actually expect that their plans are going to be finalized by the end of next month. So you can expect to hear more announcements about that. When we look at Pillar 1, which is about taxing the companies where the taxes should be paid rather than their home country, this is expected to have a negative impact on Singapore, for example, because they're going to find that tax bases are going to be allocated to other market jurisdictions out of Singapore, because that's where a number of big players are based. And then in terms of having a minimum tax rate, they're currently talking about having an agreed minimum tax rate of 15%. So let's see what happens next month. Next slide. So we've got all this disruption, we've got all this uncertainty going on. What's interesting, well, we do a survey of business leaders every year. So we did the survey last year, you know, with the pandemic going on at the end of last year. And it was interesting to note that, you know, business leaders still remain confident that they can steer their business in a new direction post-pandemic, whatever that turns out to be. So over to you, Steve.
No, thanks so much, Paul. I mean, your example of the 7-Eleven, you know, is a very personal experience you've had, and really not so long ago that would have been such a was so much outside of our thoughts. So that's really amazing, and I'm so pleased that you brought up the sustainability green initiative perspective, and I'd like to discuss that in our interactive session, which we're about to start. However, we have, and I really apologize, we have been having some technical difficulties, more than one, unfortunately. So I do apologize for that. Michael, his audio earlier was cutting in and out, and so therefore we didn't get the chance to conclude his slides, and some of the information he's got there is really, really important. So I'd like to return to those if Michael is there, I believe, in audio, and
Yes.
we're going back to the slides. Thanks so much, Michael, and apologies for the technical difficulties, Michael.
Yeah, no apologies. No,
But if
my
we
end
could
as
pick
well,
up that there, because this information is really important.
Okay, fantastic. So maybe on the slide before, and one more slide. Yeah. So I think what we have seen since last year, right, is that after all these challenges and the new supply chain networks that I mentioned earlier, where we are going to from a linear model to an omni-channel model. Now what we have is the real estate front. We have retailers exiting expensive retail space, and then players like Amazon taking over that space. We saw that in the US with Sears and JCPenney's, where Amazon got their department stores. And next animation, and on the supply chain front, what we see is that for urban logistics, especially during high seasonal peaks like the Singles Days, operations can be super inefficient, and that's why companies will need to explore automation, especially when we're going to anything, shopping for anything from e-commerce and expecting a same-day delivery. So automation will allow for high storage density. And this will be, typically robotized. It will have microfilament technologies. So already we see that, not so much in Asia, microfilament, but in the US and in Europe, we see that, which allows increasing picking speeds, and it can reduce costs by 10 times for operations. Next slide, please. So going to that kind of last mile and e-commerce. So nowadays, I think everybody's talking about ultra-fast delivery, or quick commerce, sometimes it's called. So on the left, you have all these companies that are doing quick commerce. They are focusing, so they have dark stores. So they, in order to be able to deliver under 30 minutes or even 10 minutes, as some of them promise, you need to be very close. You have your inventory very close to the end consumer. And I mentioned 10 minutes. Gorillas, this is a Berlin-based company. They promise a 10-minute delivery. And this is, by the way, it's 2,000 to 3,000 products they usually have in the dark store. The dark store is around 200 to 300 square meters. So this promise is very enticing to investors. So Gorillas is now has a valuation of over 1 billion. China's Tencent is one of the major investors. But you don't have companies like Getir. You don't have it here. It's in Europe. It's a Turkish company that's valued over $2.5 billion. So a lot of money going to that direction. And there's a lot of expansion now in Asia as well. Food Panda is the kind of the main player here with their Panda Mars. They're leading the way. But one of their big challenges is how to manage this rapid expansion for their dark store footprint, because dark stores are not your typical asset. Is a different kind of asset class. It's not logistics. It's not retail. It's something in between. Next slide, please. And this is just my final slide. So how this connects to supply chain and real estate is that, what does that fulfillment model look like? And we see the two different kinds of fulfillment models for dark stores. One is through a DC, where all the products are first consolidated before reaching the dark store. So essentially now this is an e-retailer DC. And this typically is a kind of a big box, and it's easier to have automation there. So Flipkart in India is doing that. And the other option is having your product shipped directly from the manufacturer or the distributor warehouse to the dark store. And this is what Pandemart is doing. And so these, of course, these two different options will have a different costs, different efficiencies, different speeds. And this is something that a question that all these companies are looking at. And of course, it will have an impact in real estate, logistics real estate, and that new kind of asset class, which is that dark store real estate in markets across Asia and Southeast Asia. Yep, thank you, Stephen.
No, thank you. It's fascinating, and it was so good to come back to your slides, Michael, because it really, your slides so clearly demonstrating how the landscape is going to change and how significantly the real estate sector is going to be impacted by totally different logistics and support models and consumer behaviors. As Dr. William and also as Paul was mentioning, you know, the consumer behaviors, the consumer patterns, the methods, the expectations are all going to be so different. And we're only seeing really the start of that, as we saw with Dr. Williams' slides, the exponential growth that's happening in relation to online sales, but also in the overall consumer paradigm. It's still relatively small percentages. So the amount of transition in front of us is still very, very significant. And that does bring up, I mean, surely a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities in relation to the real estate sector and what's going to be happening in cities and what's going to be happening in metropolitan areas and the redistribution of retail centres and real estate property and pricing and all those types of things. And the consumer experience is going to be ever more important in retail spaces. It's really, really fascinating. We do have some questions from our audience today, and I'd like to read out one. As more retail brick and mortar stores are closing and more consumers are purchasing online, will it benefit the overall SC, or would this in fact create bigger challenge? Implementing last mile strategies, inventory costs, demand planning, transportation costs.
I mean, I guess the answer is for me is yes. It will create a bigger challenge. It's as I mentioned, the costs associated with online versus offline are so much bigger, and also you lose track. So in China, for example, to do your e-commerce now, most manufacturers choose to have a third party, like a 3PL, but basically focus on serving your Tmall's, your JD.com. So for those channels, and also some manufacturers are actually considering maybe dropping the offline, maybe just having everything online if they don't have enough volumes in new markets to jump straight to online.
Yes, it's fascinating, and that comes into another question, which has just been asked, which is are regional malls still relevant? And what are the thoughts in relation to that?
So the regional...
Are regional malls still relevant?
Like department stores, shopping malls.
Shopping malls, shopping centers,
yeah.
Yes.
I think they will be relevant but more as to showcase the product, right? And that's what we see already happening, right? So JD.com now has also an offline stores. Even in Indonesia opened recently. IKEA wants to have small of their versions within the city centers, but it's more of a showcase, I would say. But definitely you need that.
No, I think that's right, and I think that I agree with you fully, Michael. That I think they're going to be still relevant, but they're going to be relevant in different ways. And the experience that they need to offer and the amenity that they need to provide needs to change, or maybe not so much change, but really evolve into, you know, higher levels of experience and eventing and those types of things, as well as completing the loop, because so often a lot of the online sales, etc., they're very good at getting the product out, but they're not so good necessarily at dealing with the issues when there's a problem, or etc., etc. And I think that some of the competition is going to shift to those customer satisfaction, customer response type attributes, and that's where regional centres, malls, shopping centres, facilities, even last mile facilities that at the moment don't have any direct contact with the consumer may in actual fact evolve into having an interrelationship with the consumer to address with issues and maximize satisfaction and repetitive consumer behavior through those online portals. If anybody else wants to jump in at any time, please feel free to do that. And if not, I am going to keep continuing with questions that we're receiving.
Actually,
yes, please.
Yeah, if I could, I did want to share just one example from one of our network members that I had been working with a couple of months ago, who oversees a very large retail operation throughout Indonesia. And you know, when you're talking about repurposing the space and using it as a showcase opportunity, you know, they came up with what I thought was an intriguing workaround during some of the lockdowns in Indonesia, where the customers couldn't come to the stores, but the staff could. And so what they were doing was essentially having people call them via WhatsApp and having the staff members go around the store with their phone, being able to show them the product, show them the size, show it how it looked relative to everything else. And like I said, that's a workaround, but it's an intriguing idea in that you've got a digital sale taking place, combining it with the brick and mortar facility. And you know, they could look at taking that idea and maybe expanding it into something else.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I can, you know, you can imagine in the fashion industry, I mean, obviously events are going to be really important for the fashion industry and that sort of interaction, but then also being able to slightly customize and bespoke fashion garments, etc., is something that hasn't really taken off. It's become mass consumerism, and we could now see more and more bespokeness happening and more customization, and hence interactions physically and virtually, but still in a way where the real estate sector will need to recognize and change and reward people that are starting to go into those different modes of interaction. And I think that's all in front of us, very much so. Another question was, and a question close to my heart, so thank you to this attendee. How can supply chains become more sustainable while remaining efficient and innovative?
I mean, that's a huge question, and also depends how you define sustainable, right? I know, Stephen, you know that. So you have the can you hear me?
Yes, Michael, you've come back.
So it depends how you define sustainable. I mean, now all companies have their net zero carbon targets outlined for 2030, 2040. So it looks like it's a top-down directive. Nations, companies, everybody's is going through that journey, regardless actually of the customer. It looks like it's been driven top down, which is actually great because that's actually how it's going to work. It looks like it, at least. And now supply chains, by the inception, they have to be sustainable because they have to be efficient. They have to reduce cost. So in a way, a supply chain by itself, a head of supply chain, what his target is to reduce their costs, which means, let's say, his logistics costs can be translated in transportation costs. So the fewer miles the truck will do, he will hit his KPI, but also hence he will reduce his carbon footprint. So they go hand in hand. Now, the challenge is that the consumer now, what we see is that they require, they're pushing supply chains to become inefficient. That's what e-commerce does. So unless technology comes in, automation, technology, IoT, everything to basically smooth out all that noise and let's say, for example, consolidate all packages that are delivered within your building by different 3PLs, right? Because you can have DHL, you can have SingPost, you can have different companies delivering at the same time in the same building. So as long as this is being done, then you will not have efficiency in it, and it's going to be difficult to have a sustainable supply chain. So but yeah, through innovation, through technology, I believe we can achieve that.
Yes. I mean, just in relation to that, I think one of the sad things at the moment is in relation to the online platforms is that a lot of the sustainability focus for products and services and companies is not really visible. It was on their websites and on a lot of their marketing materials and their in-store promotional materials, etc., and their staff training was so much in relation to how they're improving sustainability and the participation of their workforce and their customers into advancing sustainability and green initiatives. I think on the online platforms and everything else, that's one of the things that has been diminished. It's certainly in relation to visibility. And I think it will come. And I think it will come very, very significantly. And I think that the people that adopt the sustainable platforms and the transparency for green initiatives and not just the words and the feel-good factors associated with sustainability, but really hard metrics and really transparent facts to demonstrate that they really are achieving things and it's a differentiator for their businesses in comparison to their competitors. I think that that's a really important, I think it's obviously really important from an environmental sustainability angle, but I think it's also important, as you said, Michael, in relation to their economic sustainability, because if you can reduce packaging, you're reducing a cost, but you're also reducing materials usage. And so there's so many alignments between the 4 pillars of sustainability, which was the feature of IRIS 2020 in relation to the economic and how that interrelates into the environmental, and then also into the social and human pillars, which is very much about the retail sector and the logistics sector, because it's really all about that interaction. And again, it's not so much mass market, because retail is going back very much into the individual transaction once again, but through technology and through the online platforms. It's really fascinating. It really, really is. I'm going to press on with some questions. There's one here. I'll read it out. With the disruption of technology coupled with the pandemic shaped by e-commerce taking place, hence the industrial spaces and retail outlets are repurposed. What about wellness, real estate, hospitality, office space? So the question there is about the overbuilt spaces and vacancies being at an all-time high, since much can be done remotely in Southeast Asia, whether the market is opening up or otherwise. And in relation to that question, I think that with all the retail space out there, it will be utilized. It's just how will it be utilized, and who will be the people that will be the market leaders in relation to the repurposing, the reorientation, and the re-engagement with consumers and customers and tenants, etc. I think no buildings are going to go to waste for very long. And there's the challenge associated with that, but there's also huge opportunities.
Yeah, if I can touch on that, especially in terms of office space and commercial office space. What we're seeing with our network members here in Singapore in particular is that they are changing the concept of the space. So it's not just about providing a workspace or office space to a client, because the clients are reducing their footprint, they're going to hybrid work models, and they're simply not in as often. And so what the building management firms, what the successful ones at least are doing, is repurposing that space and actually bringing in some of the other things you talk about, like the wellness, for example, bringing that into the office space, or they are providing experiences, not just space. So they are providing guest speakers. They are providing training and development opportunities where they're bringing teams in, or they're providing services to their tenants that might previously have been provided within a company, but now being provided by the office space provider. So I think taking that idea and looking at the other sectors, again, the idea of repurposing space and finding new ways to attract and retain your customers is going to be essential. One of our hotel members, in fact, was talking about this back in February, when he said that, we never saw our high-end restaurants as delivery or takeaway places. And he said, then we didn't have a choice. Then they had to be delivery here in Singapore, where you couldn't go out and go to a food and beverage outlet. And he said, now we're going to keep that going because that's a revenue stream we didn't see before. And now we've seen, yeah, it works, and we're going to do it. So these spaces are there, and I agree with you, Stephen. They're going to be used. They're going to be used. But the purpose behind those spaces may not be the purpose for which they were originally built, and that's okay. What matters is using the space efficiently.
No, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. William. Paul, in relation to everything that we've been discussing and the redefining of logistics and retail real estate, what do you think the number one challenge and the number one opportunity is going to be, as we venture very rapidly now into 2022 and beyond?
Well, the number one challenge.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of challenges there. I think I like what we're talking today about is about repurposing of the current retail space and the office space. I like what you said as well about like we're talking about the malls, the regional malls, etc. And I'll visit a mall in Thailand, and I'll be surprised the people that are there in a pandemic, and really hit me. It's more about, it's going to be more about the experience, right? That you go to the mall, it's to do something to do on the weekend. So they're going to attract people that way. I also like the idea with the offices to get people to come back to the office because they're holding events and other services around that. So, as I said, we think like business leaders are still very confident that they can about dealing with the challenges. Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the future is going to be, what it's going to look like.
Yes, yes. And as you said earlier about the dynamics associated with taxation and the ever greater visibility of financial transactions through online platforms, etc., it's really going to change. And that was a really good point that you brought that up, Paul, earlier, because it's really going to change the ability for governments to recognize the transactions that are happening within their domain, within their financial boundaries, and that the way that they agree to deal with that. And also, as the workforce will surely become more fragmented and dislocated from their resident place of business, that's going to be ever more important. And picking up on what Dr. Williams said earlier, in relation to where the growth is going to happen and how that's not necessarily in some of the big economies, but in the emerging middle class, as per the slide that he presented to us. And it's a really, really powerful point, because it's not only the emerging middle class of the people of that country, but it's also of the emerging middle class that relocates to those countries, because those countries are more affordable, because they don't necessarily have to be spending time in their normal regional office or their normal home country, etc. There's a really strong dynamic there as well, isn't there?
Sure.
Yeah,
I think, look, if we're in Southeast Asia, we've got the Asian Economic Community as well, AEC, and there's a framework there that they can work with to, if you want to allow with people being able to work across borders, because there still are issues, and with people being able to move, around countries as you're proposing and carry on their business or provide their services. So there is a framework there. It'll be interesting to see if that's utilized more as well.
Yes, yes. And just in relation, we have a question here about new technologies and such as RFID tech, digital kiosks. So that's more on the physical real estate space. And then of course there's things like delivery drones and all that type of technology, and Amazon with their Beehive patent and all sorts of technologies there. And the question is, that the retail has emerged throughout the course of the pandemic, and certain people have been struggling, certain people have been doing extremely well. What do we think in the region? Has it caught up with the technological advances, or is the retail sector lagging behind the advancement and utilization of technology?
Well, I can speak on the logistics front. I mean, no, it's lagging, definitely, compared to the US, Europe, Australia, and it's mainly down to cost.
Yes.
So you can, it's the, basic maths, right? If you buy an AMR, a mobile robot, let's say that pushes, let me take my video, a trolley from one end of the warehouse to the other, and it costs you $50,000, and that takes out one person, one warehouse worker. How much does a warehouse worker cost in Thailand versus Singapore? So in Singapore, yes, the case studies there. In Thailand, is not. Of course, further to cost, there's a lot of other issues: is security, safety, efficiency, reliability. 24/7 operations, all these kind of things, which now these are driving a lot of those requirements versus just cost, which was historically what was the barrier.
Yes.
And following on to that, kind of looking at other points in the supply chain, and getting to a question that came up a little bit later on here, I believe from Adelpha, about real-time visibility and supply chain visibility in particular. There is a growing interest, at least, in improving real-time visibility over the supply chain from end to end, and having the data tools necessary to provide that real-time data. So, rather than doing your scenario planning based on 3-week-old data that is in your Excel spreadsheet, you instead have the AI systems that can help you not only see what's happening now, but what disruptions might be coming along the way. You're also looking at trying to improve predictive capability, so that you can get those shoes onto that shelf, into that store on the day that they're going to need to be there, rather than going through the ordering process. And that's another element, going back to an earlier question, in supporting sustainability, that with better predictive capability and more agility that allows you to get around disruptions, you can reduce waste. You can reduce waste in your production, overproducing. You can reduce the incidence of empty containers. And there was one figure that was put out a few months ago suggesting that 20% of the containers on board ships were empty at any given time on the planet, which is just insane. But given all the disruptions in the supply chain, it's not totally unexpected. So some of those technologies as well are going to be very useful. The biggest challenge, and I hear this from everybody that I talk to who's involved in this, the biggest challenge is going to be finding the talent with the skills to use those tools and be able to work in this different way. So it's going to require an upskilling or complete reskilling of some of the workforce in order to get them to the point where they can use these tools in a way that actually does what we hope that it's going to do.
No, thank you very much for that. And I think we'd like to finish with one last question. And the question here is short. It says, what do you think should be the action plan that shopping centres should prepare in facing the current situation? And perhaps I can expand that to not only shopping centres, but the whole of retail space. what should be in their action plan? My initial thoughts in relation to that, following on from what you just said, Dr. William, about how not only is how the real estate is repurposed, both physically and logistically, etc., but also in relation to the commercial relationship between the tenant and landlords. I think that's going to change quite significantly. We've seen several transitions for that in the last couple of decades, and I think that there's some more to go with that. In my value management consulting, we've really focused in relation to different models of relationships between landlord and tenant, and also, as you said, in relation to staff and personnel and about how they're trained. In some ways, I think that in some ways the online retail experience is more personable than the in-person retail experience was becoming. It was becoming quite impersonal, and online, one of the funny attributes is that it's been quite personal and interactive in relation to communication, and I think that's one of the other things that the physical real estate sector needs to embrace, from both the tenant side and from the landlord side. Are there any thoughts in relation to that, the action plans that people should be thinking about?
Just on shopping centers, so Jalal, so we did an exercise for one of the biggest shopping operators in Europe, and the question is, how do we repurpose our space? So we looked at 20 of their shopping malls, and identified potential logistics, last mile logistics space. But further to that is how do you work with the landlord, with the city as well, to develop these future kind of this future space where both the consumer, the landlord, and a tenant, but also the government as well, basically live together harmoniously, and everybody benefits from that future space, because a lot of the value that comes out of efficiency and of having last mile close to in the side shopping center is actually for the citizen of the city. So less congestion, less pollution, which actually someone has to pay for that. And often all this kind of consolidation efficiencies end up at the the retailer, which cannot afford that, the tenant of that shopping mall. So I think one action plan is how to get all the parties together to work towards a future city.
Yes.
And we've looked a lot at over the last few decades at the growth of mixed use developments, where you've got residential, you've got retail, and you've got commercial, office space, all located close to each other. One of the things that I've seen that I find very intriguing is mixed use shopping malls, where all of those same elements are in there. So, for example, here in Singapore, we have a mall that really, we have plenty of malls in Singapore, right? So it was probably time to repurpose some of them. And this one basically shut down for about 2 years and came back with retail and with the movie theaters and the restaurants and a WeWork. And so now you've got office space in there. And so just as you might go to a tech company and they say, oh, you work here, and then we have a cafeteria and a massage therapist and doggy daycare and all that. This mall provides something very similar. It's got a lot of complementary mixed-use services, in addition to retail, but not exclusively retail. And really, it's taken that mixed-use community idea and put it into one building, and is proving to be a very, very popular space.
Yes, no, very much. No, that really does help to look at the action plan. Looking at the time, I'd like to thank all of our panelists very much. Dr. William Thomas, Director for Southeast Asia from the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network. Michael Ignatiades, Head of Supply Chain and Logistics Solutions from Jones Lang LaSalle. Asia Pacific. Thank you, Michael, and Paul Ashburn from HLB. Thank you so much for your presentations and for the discussion today. It's really very much appreciated. And thank you for everyone for joining the webinar today. Please feel free to send your inquiries to the email on the screen, and stay connected to the Property Guru Asia Real Estate Summit social media channels and of course the website, asiarealestatesummit.com. The next edition of Property Guru Asia Real Estate Summit Virtual Edition opens on the 8th of December 2021 and is part of the Property Guru Week, just before the Property Guru Asia Property Awards Grand Final. This year's virtual summit is about the data revolution in real estate. And we'll talk about the data landscape in real estate, sustainability, of course, green tech and finance, and the recovery of our economy with global speakers, including Dr. William Thomas, who you've met today, the original voice of Siri, Susan Bennett, who'll give the international keynote on becoming the voice of AI. Omid Saberi, he's the senior industry specialist for the International Finance Corporation in Washington, DC for the World Bank. He's doing a keynote presentation for us. Also a case study by Koi Koari, co-founder of Privacy by Design Lab in Japan. The former US Ambassador for Asian Development Bank, Curtis Chin, now Senior Fellow of Asia for the Millikan Institute, will be joining us. Time 100 Next honoree Kung Varakom, who's CEO and founder of Porous City Network from Thailand, will be joining us, and I'll be there as well, along with many, many other really interesting speakers. And of course, you know, the data revolution, it's upon us. We have to deal with it, or it will deal with us. And that's what we're going to be exploring in December this year. Thank you for joining this webinar. We'll see you at Property Guru Week in December and at the next Property Guru Real Estate Summit Virtual Edition and the Awards Grand Final. Thank you so much, and we'll see you at our next webinar as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.